comes in so many forms. From the voice, from the heart, arising from pianos, organs, cymbals. I think of these words from Ernesto Cardenal, who wrote, "The music of the spheres, a harmonious universe like a harp. Its rhythms are the equal repeated seasons, the beating of the heart, day, night, the going and returning of migratory birds, the cycle of stars and of corn, the mimosa that enfolds by day and folds up again by night, rhythms of moon and tide, a single rhythm in planets, atoms, sea, and apples that ripen and fall in the mind of Isaac Newton, melody, accord, discord, arpeggios, the harp of the universe. Unity behind apparent multiplicity. That is the music, and it is for that music that we come week by week. Let us worship together.
We lift our hearts in thanks today for all the gifts of life, and first for peace that turns away the enmities of strife.
And now it's your turn. We can only become a worshiping congregation to the extent you're willing to sing it into being. This is not a spectator sport. We all take part, and you do so with your voices. As we sing our first hymn, a text and a tune we've all sung before, so I trust you will be loud, lusty, and eager. Number 6, Just as Long as I Have Breath. Would you join me now in the responsive invocation, words from Bruce Catton. The present moment is nice, but it does not last. Living in it is like waiting in a junction town for the morning limited. The junction may be interesting, but someday you will have to leave it, and you do not know where the limited will take you. Sooner or later, you must move down an unknown road that leads beyond the range of the imagination, and the only certainty is that the trip has to be made. In this respect, early youth is exactly like old age. It is a time of waiting before a big trip to an unknown destination. The chief difference is that youth waits for the morning limited, and age waits for the night train. Well, you can tell I looked for these things all week long. I was already called out on the quote at the top. I hope you appreciate Margaret Atwood at her most incisive. I'm looking at John Hansen here. He's listed here in the program. So come on up. It's your turn to do the opening here. You got to say who you are. I just introduced you, but who else knows you? John Hansen will be delivering our welcome this morning. Good to see you.
Good morning. Last summer I saw a Facebook message asking for a parent from the group related to youth programming, character school, Tower Club to come up and give a welcome at some point during the year. And like many things happening on Facebook, I may or may not regret having volunteered for that right now. My name's John Hansen. My wife is Rose, and my daughters are Campbell and Reese, and they're upstairs right now at character school. And I did want to share a few thoughts about our youth programming here, and also just to say welcome. In the fall, or rather the spring of 1995, I was at a church right up the hill, Central Reformed Church at the top of the hill on Fulton. And I was getting ready to graduate from high school, and the gentleman that ran that congregation at the time was a guy named Robert Bedingfield, and he asked me to deliver the Youth Sunday message at Central Reformed Church. And being kind of impulsive, like I frequently am, I said, sure, why not? And I strolled out there, and I reached under the podium where there was a glass of water, and I held it up and took a really long drink, and I said, I've always wanted to do that. And it got a pretty good laugh from the crowd at the time, and then I proceeded to do what I do, and sometimes being a little bit subversive, and instead of talking about Bible verses, I talked about Schrodinger's cat and Potter's box and things that I found interesting to me. And what I was surprised by after I did that was that there were people coming up to me who had been out in that congregation, and they were patting me on the back and said, thank you for bringing some of those thoughts into the message today. I'm a psychologist, and I think the Potter's box is fascinating. Or I'm a mathematician and a physicist, and I think Schrodinger's cat is an amazing thought experiment. About 10 years later, my new wife and I were back in Central Reformed Church after jaunting around the globe, and we were out where you are, sitting in the congregation, and a young fella came up to the podium just like I had, and he reached under the podium. He came out with a glass of water, and he held it for a really long time, took a long drink, and looked everybody in the eye and said, I've always wanted to do that. What I realized in that moment is that all of us are part of teaching the youth, no matter what age we are. I was 18 at the time that I did that, and that kid was probably 7 or 8 years old. And that message resonated with him enough that whether it was just to get a laugh or something more meaningful, he came out and mimicked what I'd done. And I'd never expected in a million years, especially a decade later, that something like that would have lived that long. If you flash forward to about 4 years ago, my daughters and I were riding home from here shortly after we started attending. And as parents do, I was telling my daughter a sanitized version of one story or another. And she clearly could see that I wasn't giving her the whole story. And she said to me, Dad, it's not the whole story if you leave out the rough parts. And I asked her where she learned that. And that was here at character school at Fountain Street Church. Our children are growing up in a world that is cynical and complicated and sometimes cruel. And what they need is all of the information they can get, all of the free thought that they can get. And a lot of us in this room grew up in a world where we were trying to get more information. They actually have so much that they need to know what to do with it. And there aren't very many places left in this city or this state or this country or even this world where they can get access to that. It's a fragile thing, and it's something that we really, really need to continue to prioritize as a community, and I'm very grateful that we do. So thank you for coming this morning. Thank you for all that you do, and I do truly hope that you will continue to support the youth programming here at this church, because it's very, very important to our future, certainly for Rose and I and our children, but I think for our country and our community and our world as well. Morning.
If you detected a similarity to the gospel tradition, that's quite intentional. It's a genre, it's a style, and some of us who take part in the Martin Luther King Day observance learned how to do that. We learned it's a high-powered, high decibel, high energy experience. So if your response is very typical because it's meant to inject energy into the room, which they did. I should also point out that that term, total praise, is a nice lead into the readings because my whole year has been about the book of Psalms, but in Hebrew it's not called Psalms, which is a Greek word that means song, an accompanied song, meaning with a lyre or a harp. The Hebrew word is Tehillim, which means praises. All the Psalms are considered collectively a book of praise, even the Psalms that don't sound like they're being very praising of anyone. This morning I'm reading out of Psalm 137. I'm not doing it in order now because I'm focusing on a subject this month of remembering. And perhaps the most famous psalm about remembering is the one I'm going to read a portion of now. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth. Say, sing one of the songs of Zion. How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. That text has been set I don't know how many times to music and has shown up in literature all over the place. You'll hear another version of it briefly in my sermon just to acquaint you with one version. I have two other passages, one that's old and one that's new. I'll do the new one first because the old one is more satisfying. The new one by Alexander McCall Smith that I found this week, and again, it's always a hunt for things worth saying. He writes, we choose younger and younger politicians to lead us because they look good on television and we're sharp. But really, we should be looking for wisdom and choosing people who had acquired it, and such people in general looked bad on television, gray, lined, and thoughtful. I think well of Senator McCain today with that in mind. And then William Butler Yeats, also opining on age. Though leaves are many, the root is one. Through all the lying days of my youth, swayed my leaves and flowers in the sun. Now I may wither into truth. Think about that. Wither into truth. I'm dressed down a little today, no necktie. Not because I don't like them. I'm not encouraging you men to do without them, although I have no problem with that. And I'm wearing my walking shoes today because, like I said, I'm going on the hunger walk later with some members of a team. For those who don't know, I am a political candidate, and we're doing this as a service to the community. So if you see us, I'll be wearing my other hat. But my point about this being the time of prayer is that prayer is not just sitting and thinking deep thoughts. Sometimes it's doing things. Rabbi Heschel, who went to Selma and famously said that he was praying with his legs as he crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, also wrote, prayer invites God to be present in our spirit and in our lives. Prayer cannot bring water to a parched land, nor mend a broken bridge, nor rebuild a ruined city. In other words, it's not going to do magical things. But prayer can water an arid soul, mend a broken heart, and rebuild a weakened will. We hear a lot of talk about building up infrastructure. And I don't think we can do that until our spiritual infrastructure is attended to. Lacking the will to do it, it doesn't matter how many laws get passed. So rebuilding a weakened will is a very powerful thing to consider. So I'm going to ask you, what is it you've been putting off doing? We all have a list. Some of them are really long. Mine's really long. And let's pray on that. Nameless one. To say we have sinned is easy and obvious and makes no news at all. For none of us have done all the good we could do, nor repaired all the bad we have done, or, for that matter, shown up when we could have shown up in all the places we've been. But we're not here to be bad or to bask in our failure, but to say, what will it take to do the tough thing? What fear, what sorrow, what pain, what anger is standing between us and the step we have to take to do the thing we know we have to do? We need not say what they are, but we know in our hearts there's always at least one thing that we should be doing that we're not. Think on that for a moment. Ponder it. What fear stands between you and that step? It could be very real. There could be danger, no doubt. But when was anything important without risk? And when was anything good accomplished without the possibility of loss? How to rebuild a weakened will. Can't do it alone. And you, nameless one, all you can do is listen. But perhaps someone nearby is listening too. Struggling to take a step they find fearsome. Angry that they cannot be where they wish to be. Maybe we can hold each other's hand and do what we long to do, what will make us truly alive. Upon this and all that dwells in our hearts, we pray in that place that can only be framed by silence. And so may it be. And what could be a better amen than music itself? As is my custom, I lift up the names of those who in years present and past reached the conclusion of their lives among us. Ask their blessing upon us, and that we remember them with the clarity and candor they deserve. I lift up the name of Steele Taylor, who passed away just a week or so ago, of Mary Jane Brooks and Jack Weiss, of Ken Childs and Adrian Sweats, of Tim Rosema, Gordon Boozer, Geneva Butner, and Roy Porter. These, known or unknown to you or to me, laid the bricks and raised the roof of this place, either in person or in spirit, and made for us a home to be present this day. They left gifts for us to be found year after year in seasons, times, and occasions. And we lift up our hearts in gratitude and share an ancient prayer, El Malay Rachamim, Shokim Barachamim, Hamatzeh Menucho. God, filled with mercy, dwelling in the heavens heights, bring proper rest beneath the wings of your Shekinah, your presence, to the souls of our beloved and who have gone to their eternal place of rest. May you, who are a source of mercy, shelter them beneath your wings eternally. May you bind their souls to you and to we the living, that they may rest at peace, that we may be at peace. And let us say, Ve'imru, Amen. In case you're wondering, all these plants around here are from the Kendall graduation. I kind of like them. I find it curious that a place like Fountain Street Church, that we say we love nature, but we don't have any of it indoors. It's kind of refreshing to see a growing thing in our midst. So enjoy while you can. I was mindful this week as I was writing about this sermon of a moment that was almost exactly 17 years ago when my family and I, myself, my wife, our two sons, were traveling back from London after a 4-month journey that was my one and only sabbatical in my 40 years of clergy service. And it was also the last journey we would take together as a foursome of any consequence. Our eldest was about to go to college in a year or so, so it was a watershed moment for us. And the memory of that journey has stayed with me in very powerful and precious ways. And I'm sure you all have a story similar of a moment when you and your family reached a memorable spot. And I'm going to be thinking about memory a lot, because our theme in chapel and character school and sanctuary is remembering as we head toward Memorial Day, which is inspired obviously by that holiday, but also by our custom here of reciting the names of our dead for a given year. And I have been prevailed upon our wonderful music director to provide us with Adagio's Barber with that, and together they make one of the most meaningful and poignant moments in our church year. So it seemed worthy of thinking about remembering all month long, because it's much more than Memorial Day, laying wreaths on solemn graves, or even thinking about our dead. It's bigger than that. In fact, it is an essential part of being human to remember. If we did not remember, we would not be very human, would we? In the book of Psalms, which I mentioned is where I've been landing every Sunday in this given year, remembering shows up a lot. In fact, I found a very scholarly article of some 20 pages talking about the semantics of remembering in the book of Psalms. You're not going to get a quote. But it did notice that 61 Psalms have some reference to remembering, or its converse, not forgetting. And of course, the most famous is that one that I read earlier. And I prevailed upon our choir to give you a musical version by William Billings, because it's in our hymn book and we should learn it. So I'm going to ask them to sing the William Billings version of By the Waters of Babylon. And I'm going to get Ms. Marilyn to come and make that happen. So I want you to listen to this. It's actually in our hymn book, so it's something we could sing. It's also around, but don't get worried. We're not going to do that today. It's a very simple tune, but it evokes the quality of the psalm in itself. It flows downward like water. By the waters, as waters come down. And then in the second part, we sat down and wept. You could hear the weeping, and then wept with a little rest for thee, Zion. We remember, and then the same phrase, we remember, in different notes, but exactly the same pattern comes to an end. So we have the waters, the weeping, and the remembering. Very powerful. Thank you, choir, for illustrating. Remembering is not limited to the book of Psalms, though. I kept poking around all over Hebrew scripture, and I can find remembering being important all the way back to the book of Exodus, the famous 10 Commandments. Who can remember which one says, remember the Sabbath day? Remembering is the thing you are commanded to do. Not just to do the Sabbath day, but to remember it. In many respects, though, the whole of Torah, in fact, the whole of Jewish scriptures is about remembering and forgetting. The book of Exodus begins with, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph, did not remember Joseph. And That's how the story begins. And ultimately, ancient Israel, which is founded at the end of the book of Joshua, crumbles to dust as it is invaded by Assyrians and Babylonians. Why? Because the kings forgot to keep the covenant. And then when they are allowed to come back in the final two books of the story of ancient Israel with Ezra and Nehemiah, what they do is they teach the people what they had forgotten, and they put on sackcloth and ashes because they lamented having forgotten the commandment. In Torah and in Tanakh and all of Jewish scriptures, remembering is a commandment and therefore forgetting is a sin. And I'm here to tell you that's true for us, whether or not we are Jews or Christians or even believers. Remembering is required. Forgetting is a sin. So why am I giving you all this scriptural stuff? So you know your preacher knows what he's talking about, of course. But also because remembering is powerful. And yes, it is a spiritual endeavor, even when it's taken out of Bibles and churches. That reminds me of another story. So here I'm remembering for you. It is older than the story of us coming back on an airplane, which I will come back to, by the way. When our youngest was in second grade, he was in PS 8 in Brooklyn, where all the students came from the families of those who worked in the neighborhood, not those who lived there, because those who lived there sent their children to private schools. We did not, or at least not this one. And so he was surrounded by Eritreans and Indians and Hispanic folk and folks from Africa. In fact, let me put it this way. If you wanted to find Stephen in a picture of the entire school, you would only have 5 or 6 kids you could really pick out. But the point is, he didn't notice that. And they didn't notice that. In fact, the story I want to tell you is that they were all reading a story in his second grade class called The Singing Man, which is a children's book about an old man who wanders from village to village and takes a young man with him to teach him how to sing the songs of the people, to teach them their history. The old man was what they call a griot. And the end of the story is the old man dies, but the young man puts on the robe of the griot and takes up the task of singing the stories to the people. And the children in my son's class were busy making it into a play, and they were designing a set, and they were all getting clothing and costumes, and they had to pick a singing man, the griot. And who did they pick? The least African boy in the class. But they chose him. It wasn't a choice of the teachers. It was his African and African-American students said, Steve is the singing man who has not an ounce of African blood in him. I know, because I know my ancestry, and it's got nothing. There are times when second graders have a lot to teach us. Those kids knew what counted and what didn't, and they knew that what Steve looked like or what they looked like was irrelevant to the story itself, which is of remembering and carrying forward a story. They, at 7, had not yet learned the falsehoods that we adults acquire, and therefore they could remember the truths that we like to forget on our way through growing up. Remembering is a task that is harder for adults because, A, we have a lot to remember, and because we need to remember far more than they do. And not just as individuals. We need to remember as communities. When a people forgets, be it the children of Israel in Goshen who forgot their God, or in America, when we forget our story in its depth and its complexity, we risk the awful truth that George Santayana famously coined: those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And if we wonder why today fascism is finding new strength in the world, it is because those who have remembered it firsthand are dying, and we have not listened to their stories. If we wonder why the Confederacy is now romantically acceptable again, or even people in Russia are pining for the Soviet era, it is because those who knew its genuine depravities are dying, and we are not listening as they go. Unless the old tell their stories, and unless the young listen, we are truly condemned to repeat the past, and a past that none of us would like to live in person. History books are not enough, friends. Yes, we can get our facts from Wikipedia. I know I do. But we also need the griots. The individual people who tell the stories of actually living at moments that only look like dates and times in books. Yes, I learned about the Holocaust, but I understood it when my homeroom teacher asked me to clean the blackboard with her, and she rolled up her sleeves and I saw the number tattooed on her arm. That was telling me the story of its reality. I heard about the Depression, but it was my mother who told me that they saved scraps of soap in little wire cages so they could use it to wash dishes and clothing, and that when she lost a $5 bill, the family did not eat that night. History may have facts, but the meaning of those facts has to be told by a person to a person who is listening. We need people to give us the meaning of things. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry writes, "We live not by things, but by the meaning of things, and only what we learn from other flesh and blood humans has any true meaning." It is not that those things that they tell us were meaningful and they're telling us. It's the fact that they're telling us that gives them meaning. They impart to you your family, your legacy, your ancestry, your moment, and their moment. The smallest event in a life can change a whole family, whether it makes it into the history books or not. And others live through momentous historical changes, in part because their families were intact. It is the remembering that imparts the meaning that gives us hope and strength. And now, here comes the kicker. If remembering is what gives life meaning, and not just individuals, but whole peoples, then the most important people in the community are the old people in the community, because they know what needs to be said. Now, I have just entered into my antiquity. That's right, it's official. I'll get it out. That is my Medicare card. I am now officially old in the sight of the state. I'm also approaching my age of retirement, and like many people, I say, well, what do I do after that? Because we live in a society that measures your value by what you produce, by your job, by the stuff you make, by the services you render. And anyone who doesn't do that because they're too young and don't know how, and too old and they don't do it fast enough, becomes irrelevant in a modern society. Am I speaking the truth or not? You know it. We are told that as we get old, we're supposed to relax. No, we don't want to relax. We want to be engaged. We want to have a role to play, but if society says, you just go over there and mutter your reminiscences, fine, but you had better sit down and listen, because we have what you need to avoid falling off the cliff of forgetfulness. Because I didn't see the Holocaust, but I know those who did. And I shudder at the thought of its ever happening again. And if you don't hear me, you will do it again. You will. For age is opportunity no less than youth itself, though in another dress. This is Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. For age is opportunity no less than youth itself, though in another dress. And as the evening twilight fades away, the sky is filled with stars invisible by day. We who are toward the twilight end of life can see the evening star, as the children at the beginning of life can see the morning star. But you 30 and 40 and 50-somethings, all you see is the sunlight. You don't know that beyond that is a galaxy of facts and truths and stories and things beyond your view, because you're busy making a life. But we are busy making meaning. And we can give that to you, because we know there are stars beyond the daylight, and that you cannot steer a ship by the sun because it falls away every day, but you can steer a ship by night because the stars are there. In these times, when everything can be recorded and stored in electronic vaults, when you can find everything you ever said online kept forever, you may think, no, there's no need to do all this remembering. But there is the lie. Stories have to be lived and told and heard for life to have any meaning at all. Stories have to be experienced and recounted before they can wither into truth. Remembering literally means to put back together, to remember. It means to connect the dots of time so you can see the thread that leads from then to now and into tomorrow. Søren Kierkegaard, the great Danish theologian, is famous for saying, life must be lived forward, but it can only be understood backward. So go ahead and live forward, but we who have a lot to look back on understand more than you know. We understand that we don't understand, which is wisdom itself. When remembering has its place again in our society, as the singing man did, then the people will learn. But we have come to a society that values only what is made and what is sold and what is purchased and what is of monetary value. The meaning has been sold, in fact, for the transient glories of possession. Marcel Proust observed that the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. I see a lot of old people in my work, 80s and 90s and beyond. And when they tell a story, they give me new eyes. I know what this place looked like before it was here, because someone told someone a story and that person told me a story. So I have a memory transplant. I have heard the voice of Milton McGarle in my ear when someone in this church remembers being baptized by him, and I know of at least two. And if you don't even know who Milton McGarle is, you have a lot of learning to do. I am in touch with John Herman Randall's granddaughter, who talks about her grandfather. He served here. These are the stars that we need to steer our lives by. The voyage that will give us new eyes. Remembering is a voyage that only the old can lead. Some weeks before we were on that last plane ride home from our adventure, that same youngest son, the one that so charmed everyone, said boldly, "Dad, traveling is boring." And I looked at him and said, "You're right. Remembering is fun." And sure enough, on that flight home, and you know if you've ever done a transatlantic or trans-Pacific flight, it's a long sitting down. We were sitting in two seats and our boys were right behind us. And somewhere in the middle of that trip, Steve looked at his brother Aaron, feeling bored obviously, and said, "Hey Aaron, remember when?" And at that moment, I realized something I did not ever understand before, that this journey they had to take together, they were inseparable. They couldn't be different. We had to be together for 4 months. We had given them a journey that would make them brothers for the rest of their lives. And I realized at that moment there will come a moment in my future when I will be lying in some room somewhere with beeps going and clocks ticking and fluids flowing, and I will be incommunicado, and they'll be sitting there watching the last moments of my life tick away in its boring momentousness, and they'll wonder what to say and do, and Steve will look at Aaron and say, "Remember when?" This is the gift we give of remembering, of imparting to them not their lives but the meaning of life itself by living it and telling it. And then someday my grandchild who has not yet been born, praise God, maybe my great-grandchild, will hear about the loony adventure their grandparents or great-grandparents took their ancestors on and how they saw the world. And maybe that journey will excite them, will drive them on, so they can find a star to guide their lives by. And then I shall have lived. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be found true in thy sight, thou who art my rock and my Redeemer.